I want to start out this video with a disclaimer. My goal is to provide an unbiased view at how I, as a centrist, perceive each candidate, which will undoubtedly make both sides of the political spectrum unhappy. If at any point you find yourself thinking, I'm being unfair, you should take a step back, look at the evidence I provide, and ask yourself, objectively, is this true, and why am I getting upset? I am a centrist, and to be quite frank, I think almost everyone should identify this way. It would be extremely uncommon to find someone who actually agrees with literally every single thing line by line that their party believes in. Personally, I wish people would take a nuanced approach to their political identities and explain their beliefs instead of lumping themselves in with one group or the other based on just one or two beliefs. But we can go into that in another video. With that out of the way, let's begin. I feel like the most fair way to align this is to go back and forth between the candidates, outlining positives and negatives, so that it doesn't feel like I'm piling on one candidate unfairly. And the first thing that I think both candidates have going for them is their vice president picks. Both are more populist-leaning candidates, meaning that the policies they believe in will be better for the average working person. Both Harris and Trump had options that would be corporatist-leaning, who they passed on for Walz and Vance, respectively. Which leads into my next positive point for both, their stated policies so far. Once again, both have taken a populist lean. Kamala has specifically called out price gouging and housing affordability as two of her main talking points, while Trump has touted no tax on cash tips, no tax on Social Security, a mass deportation on illegal immigrants, and a flat 10% tariff on all goods aimed at bringing manufacturing back into the U.S. I do, however, have a hesitation about both of their stated aims, and that leads us to our first negative for both of them. Both candidates have wavered in their messaging when it comes to their bold populist stances that they have come out with recently. I've been listening to their talking points, and both of them seem to have walked back some of their initial declarations or softened their stances in recent weeks, and for good reason. Populism is not what large donors want to hear. It should also be noted that both candidates have significantly flip-flopped on key issues. Harris has changed her mind on a mandate for electric and hydrogen-powered vehicles by 2035, now saying that she doesn't support it. She has completely reversed her stance on immigration, promising to crack down on illegal immigration in a harsher manner than Trump. She has completely abandoned Medicare for all, backed away from defund the police, and signaled new support for fracking. And Trump is about as shifty, originally floating a TikTok ban while in office and completely walking it back this election cycle, taking 180 on cryptocurrency after stating that he didn't like it during his presidency, and most notably on abortion, originally touting his appointment of the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade, and now taking a stance that it's great, leaving it up to the states, while wavering his talking points between not supporting a 6-week ban in Florida to then changing his answer to be more ambiguous, leaning towards an approval when talking to conservative outlets. As with most politicians, I think the truth is they both seem more than adept at twisting in the wind at the drop of a hat to fit their beliefs to whatever is most popular at the time. The next negative that they both share, once again, although for, in my view, slightly different reasons, is their ability, willingness, or capability to actually achieve their campaign promises. The fact is that with Joe Biden dropping out, Kamala Harris just basically picked up his entire campaign team, which seemed to make a lot of promises and not deliver. Remember promises to cancel student loan debt and stop for-profit education institutions from profiteering off students, get big money out of politics, raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, and codifying Roe versus Wade, just to name a few. Similarly, Donald Trump had quite a few promises he made on the campaign trail that he either did not completely fulfill or seemed to have ignored, including building the border wall and making Mexico pay for it, repealing Obamacare, multiple policies aimed at draining the swamp, canceling all funding for sanctuary cities, which seems like it might have been useful to protect all the cats and dogs in Ohio, and appointing a special prosecutor to investigate Hillary Clinton, which I think was probably abandoned out of self-preservation. The next negative both share is that they both have had extremely high turn in staff. Although both seem to be tough bosses, I think there are a few critical differences between their staff issues. For Trump, the number of firings and resignations seems to be about in line with the total number. However, the proportion was higher than his previous counterparts. I think this is for two reasons. The most obvious is that Trump simply had a smaller number of total staffers, which is why the percentage is higher, despite the similar numbers. The second reason is that, unlike most candidates, he has no real meaningful political networking. Imagine stepping into a brand new industry for work and trying to hire a team full of people you've never met before. There will be turnover. Obviously, he could receive recommendations. However, it seems very common sense that he would clash with at least a few of these appointees, as he was an outsider with no political inclinations. He also did a large amount of pruning, which was evident by the overwhelming amount of resignations under pressure, which accounted for 13 of the 17 total resignations in the first year. I do think Trump would have much lower turnover in a second term. However, I do believe he still holds the reputation of being a tough boss, mostly because you have to be a yes man or woman, even to his craziest ideas. Contrasted with Harris, who has been in politics for quite a while, you would think she would have a group that she could already count on. However, the numbers are just as bad as they were for Trump in his first term as president. What is even worse is that she has also had multiple people who have resigned under her come out after the fact and criticize her openly about being incompetent and blaming staffers for her own shortcomings or lack of preparation. And speaking of her experience, that is one of the positives about her candidacy. She has political experience. As the district attorney of San Francisco for 7 years, then serving as Attorney General of California for 6 years, and a senator for 4 years, most notably fighting big banks over home foreclosure abuses, which harkens back to my previous positive for her in picking walls as a more populist-leaning VP. However, speaking of Kamala's criminal justice record, she was very accurately and painstakingly criticized on her record during the 2020 primaries by Tulsi Gabbard.
I want to bring the conversation back to the broken criminal justice system that is disproportionately negatively impacting Black and brown people all across this country today. Now, Senator Harris says she's proud of her record as a prosecutor and that she'll be a prosecutor president, but I'm deeply concerned about this record. There are too many examples to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Senator Harris, your response.
As the elected Attorney General of California, I did the work of significantly reforming the criminal justice system of a state of 40 million people, which became a national model for the work that needs to be done. And I am proud of that work. And I am proud of making a decision to not just give fancy speeches or be in a legislative body and give speeches on the floor, but actually doing the work of being in the position to use the power that I had to reform a system that is badly in need of reform. That is why we created initiatives that were about reentering former offenders and getting them counseling. It is why, and because I know that criminal justice system is so broken, that I am an advocate for what we need to do to not only decriminalize, but legalize marijuana in the United States.
I want to bring Congresswoman Gabbard back in. Your response,
The bottom line is, Senator Harris, when you are in a position to make a difference and an impact in these people's lives, you did not. And worse yet, in the case of those who were on death row, innocent people, you actually blocked evidence from being revealed that would have freed them until you were forced to do so. There is no excuse for that. And the people who suffered under your reign as prosecutor, you owe them an apology.
This attack ultimately was so devastating, it caused Harris to withdraw her candidacy. The next positive is for Trump. Despite the highly charged rhetoric from seemingly every left-leaning publication and politician, Donald Trump is not actually a threat to democracy. This is obvious by the fact that Biden is, in fact, the president right now. There is no proof that if he was to get back in, he wouldn't abdicate office as soon as his term was over, especially as it would be the conclusion of his second term and he would be ineligible to run again. There are arguments that he tried to overturn the election. However, this is a laughably common occurrence, including Hillary Clinton blaming Russian collusion in 2016, Al Gore in 2000, Samuel Tilden in 1876, Andrew Jackson in 1824, and Richard Nixon in 1960. The point is, accusations of election interference are nothing new. The next negative is for Trump, and in my opinion is pretty essential to his core, which is that he is a megalomaniac. If you don't know what a megalomaniac is, it's an individual who has feelings of personal omnipotence and grandeur. This is highly evident in most of his interactions and who he surrounds himself with. For instance, you only need to listen to the way he speaks. Everything he does is the best, or the greatest ever. Although this could be a hyperbole, this paired with surrounding himself with purely devoted yes men and women only furthers this characterization, as he cannot stand to hear opinions of dissent, which also may have been a contributing factor to his high turn in staff that I had previously highlighted as another negative factor. The next negative about Kamala is that despite being the first candidate to withdraw her candidacy in the 2020 primary, she was selected as the VP because of her gender and race. And don't take my word for it. Biden mentioned this to multiple outlets when he was deciding on who his running mate would be. While I don't think this type of policy is good anywhere, it certainly should not be the basis of how we run our country. Why are we not selecting the most competent and qualified candidates? I thought these were the most important jobs in the country. Biden has made numerous appointments in his administration where the person was appointed based on sex, race, or sexual orientation, including Mayor Pete, the Secretary of Transportation, presiding over the Baltimore Bridge collapse, the shipping container backup and ensuing supply chain issues, the East Palestine train derailment, the FAA outages, Boeing plane failures and corruption, and union busting against rail workers asking for paid sick leave, just to name a few. Sam Brinton, a nuclear official who was fired after being caught stealing a woman's luggage in a Minneapolis airport. And of course, we couldn't leave out Kamala Harris, notorious for word salads so bad that if she doesn't become president, she could look into becoming a chef.
So Ukraine is a country in Europe. It exists next to another country called Russia. Russia is a bigger country. Russia is a powerful country. Russia decided to invade a smaller country called Ukraine. So basically, that's wrong.
About the significance of the passage of time, right? The significance of the passage of time. So when you think about it, there is great significance to the passage of time in terms of what we need to do to lay these wires, what we need to do to create these jobs. And there is such great significance to the passage of time.
There's one other topic I wanted to talk to you about, but let me just quickly put a button.
Okay.
Do you have any plans to visit the border?
I'm here in Guatemala today. At some point, we are going to the border. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I don't understand the point that you're making.
These are just a few quick examples. However, I wanted to adequately illustrate why not selecting positions based on someone's actual ability instead of immutable characteristics like race, gender, or sexual identity is an awful idea. The next negative for Donald Trump is his involvement with the January 6th Capitol riot. Although he did not directly tell rioters to storm the Capitol, he did use extremely inflammatory language, encouraging rally attendees to fight like hell or you're not going to have a country anymore. While the riot, in my opinion, was not as serious as some mainstream media may have you believe, in that only 4 people died, all of which were Trump supporters, it was still a terrible precedent to be set and could have been a much more dangerous outcome had rioters gotten a hold of some of the more high-profile members of Congress. Also, it should be noted that violent militaristic overthrows is how awful forms of government often come to power, like communism, totalitarianism, and militaristic dictatorships, just to name a few. The next negative is one both candidates own. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sick of these forever wars. Both Trump and Harris have vowed to continue supporting Israel in what is essentially, undeniably at this point, a genocide, with over 40,000 people killed, most of which are citizens. This is not just my viewpoint either, as the International Criminal Court, or ICC, has issued an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, as well as other top aides, citing crimes against international humanitarian law, a ruling which has much global approval. In addition to this, Kamala also supports continuing to send billions in aid to Ukraine in what is in every measurable metric a losing war. Although I do agree with Ukraine's right to defend itself, it should not be at the US taxpayers' expense. And in recent months, the US has even ratcheted up their support, sending long-range missiles to Ukraine and greenlighting attacks inside of Russia, something Vladimir Putin has sharply warned against. And although he has not done anything to retaliate against the US yet, I'm not certain I want to tempt fate against the country with the most nuclear warheads in the world. The next negative is for Kamala, and it's that she has been mostly hidden as VP. This is for a few reasons. However, the most prominent is that she was found to be the most unpopular vice president in history. Before being appointed as the candidate for the Democratic Party, I believe her rating was heavily influenced by her association with the Joe Biden administration, which has been marked by rampant inflation and very bad border policy, which I do not think was particularly fair. As in my previous point, I expressed that Joe Biden has kept her at arm's length, and I don't think she's done much one way or another. However, at the beginning, I believe what led them to leave her out in the cold was because of poor performance, which leads into her next negative, which has been her impossibly bad handling of the border. As one of the top crises facing our country currently, Harris was tapped by Joe Biden to lead the response to border challenges. I already played the laughably bad response to the question of why Kamala never visited the border. However, I would like to look a bit deeper to express just how bad the border situation is. This is probably a bit understated, as I'm sure there are many people who have crossed the border who are not accounted for or caught. However, the estimated number of illegal immigrants who have come in during the Biden-Harris regime is over 10 million, with the highest month reported as June 2021 with 188,000 illegals. As you can see, the graph shows that there has been a massive influx of illegal immigrants, which is the highest it has been in over 21 years. There are a lot of negatives attached to this massive influx in illegals. However, that would be an entire video of its own, and a lot of the facts are murky with no real stated benefits provided from the government, and critics making wild claims about the amount of government assistance provided to them. Sticking to policies, the one positive that Kamala Harris does have is that she has backed initiatives to expand broadband access and promote small businesses. Although this is something we take for advantage as you watch this video on the internet, this is actually a huge helping hand for people who are less fortunate. With an increasingly online world, not being able to access the internet is a huge disadvantage, and 1 in 5 people who do not have the internet cite affordability being the main factor as to why they do not have internet. The other piece of legislation Harris has been instrumental in is the State Small Business Credit Initiative. This allocated $3 billion in equity and venture funding for small businesses, which helped propel 70% of new jobs since 2019 being created by small businesses, an increase of 50% over 2019. On to positive Trump policies. During his tenure in office, he passed a few key pieces of legislation that were very positive, including the Abraham Accords, the Jobs Act, and the First Step Act. Quickly going over these, the Abraham Accords normalized diplomatic relations throughout the Middle East. The signatories were Israel, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan. Given the current volatility in this area, I think we can all agree on the importance of these types of efforts to foster friendlier relations between nations in this region. The next of these was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which helped individuals and corporations alike. The individual benefits included increasing the standard deduction so as to effectively eliminate the need to use an itemized deduction, and anyone who has had to file an itemized deduction can tell you that's a massive improvement. It also changed the income levels, along with lowering the actual tax rates, increasing family tax credits, and eliminating the penalty for the Affordable Care Act, which federally mandated the need to have personal health care coverage. There was also a cap on state and local taxes. However, this primarily affected high-value properties. And the final of these being the criminal justice reform, known as the First Step Act. At a very high level, it provided increased time credits for time served for those participating in recidivism reduction programming or productive activities. It also requires the Department of Justice to submit reports on effective medication-assisted treatment of opioid and heroin abuse and plans for implementing those treatment methods, reducing mandatory minimums for certain drug offenders, and applying it retroactively to current offenders, as well as an expansion of the Second Chance Act, which provided funding for re-entry programs and services. And on to the most negative legislation. Although it was not directly legislated by him, he did nominate the Supreme Court justices that overturned Roe v. Wade, returning abortion decisions to the states. Over 60% of people think that Roe v. Wade should not have been overturned. And despite people's personal opinions on the matter, one thing that I think everyone could agree on is that the way the transition back to the states was handled was extremely poorly. In certain circumstances, like in Arizona, this repealing meant the rule governing abortions was returned to one passed in 1864. Thankfully, this was repealed fairly quickly. However, not allowing some grace period for states to review and make amendments or changes to previous policy created a whiplash effect for many residents residing in the states with outdated laws. And again, although Trump did not pass the legislation himself, he has touted his appointment of the court justices that did overturn Roe v. Wade, a very unpopular position in the U.S. today. The next negative is one I think is very concerning, and that is the negative of Kamala Harris weaponizing the justice system against political adversaries. The first example of this is the attacks on Donald Trump himself. He has faced 88 criminal charges conveniently brought forth right before the 2024 election. My perception of these is that they're such a farce or have been handled in such a comically bad way that many have been dismissed. Also, when comparing some of these charges, like the documents charges versus Biden, it seems like a fairly stark contrast when Biden's case was dismissed because he was seen as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Whereas in Trump's case, it has been dismissed because of cartoonish bumbling and corruption before the hearings could even begin, including the DA having a romantic relationship with the special prosecutor who she hired to prosecute the case. Or take the New York case against Trump on altering his property valuations, something Kevin O'Leary has been highly critical of as something almost every business owner does, and has made vocal his intent to never invest in anything in New York alongside with other business leaders, citing no victim and no harm caused. Although I personally would argue that this is a type of tax evasion, I would also say the point I'm trying to make is about the uneven prosecution of Trump, which this obviously is. Another example of Harris weaponizing the justice system is Tulsi Gabbard being added to the Quiet Skies Terror Watch List program. Whether she was added for dismantling Kamala and her run in 2020, her recent criticization of Kamala, or declaring as an independent and spurning the Democratic Party, is unclear exactly why she has been added to the list. However, what is exceedingly clear is that this is a politically motivated move that seems to be fueled by retribution. While it could be argued that it is not directly provable these actions are directly attributable to Harris, it is obvious that it is at least a function of her party, which she is just a cog in the machine of. Moving on to, in my opinion, the biggest negative for Trump is his age. And I know what most people would say about this. Really, what about Roe versus Wade? As I stated before, that was handled very poorly. However, most states are taking corrective measures to pass legislation which reflect the overall values of their citizens. With age as an issue, though, this is something that affects everyone and cannot be corrected. I was hypercritical 4 years ago that Joe Biden was too old. But somehow, between people being willing to overlook his obvious senior moments and Trump not allowing him enough rope to hang himself in the debates, which, to his credit, he did this time, Biden was elected, and look at where we are now. Two hot conflicts, either of which could lead to World War III. And rampant corporate greed sparked inflation, which, in my opinion, was fueled by Biden being too futile to put his foot down and prevent either. I'm not saying this exact thing would happen with Trump, because he does not seem as far gone as Biden was in 2020. But it is still a major concern for me because I think his elderliness would probably manifest in different ways. For instance, Trump still does not seem to be able to move past the fact that Biden has been replaced at the top of the ticket. This is an incredibly poor look, and in my opinion, makes it seem like you're concerned with being able to defeat the least popular VP in history, which is frankly sad. During a conversation with a friend, I conceded the possibility of it just being a tactic to not also blow Kamala Harris out of the water before the Democratic National Convention and have them replace her as well. However, that's obviously not the case. Add to this his objectively poor performance in the debate with Kamala Harris. Yes, it was unfair, and the moderators were dogpiling and unfairly and incorrectly fact-checking, but this is something I believe would have been inconsequential to the Trump of 8 years ago. He was completely derailed multiple times on things he should have been able to easily crucify the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris on. But instead, he let his ego get the better of him and wasted his entire time making proclamations about his own grandeur. I cannot emphasize this enough. We, the American people, don't care. And this is my issue with him. I think in his old age, his megalomaniacal tendencies will be the driving factor for a lot of his actions, and I don't see that leading to positive outcomes. Even though he has assembled a group of people who have been labeled enemies of the status quo, like Elon Musk, Tulsi Gabbard, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Robert Kennedy, which I think transitions well to my last and positive point for Trump. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. As I just mentioned, I'm actually a fan of the people Trump has stated that he's looking to appoint or lean on in his administration. But that wasn't even really what this point was about. It seems like the mainstream media and the Democratic Party have forgotten, but there have been multiple assassination attempts on Trump. Trying to stay as far away from conspiracy theory land as possible, there were an unfathomable amount of extremely curious circumstances, especially surrounding the first assassination attempt. In rapid fire mode, the roof was too slanted, so no agents were stationed on it. The shooter was spotted on the roof 2 minutes before he opened fire with a gun. The shooter was observed with a rangefinder 20 minutes before the shooting. Trump was denied multiple requests for increased security. The shooter was flying a drone around the area earlier that same day. And that's just scratching the surface of the first assassination attempt. However this happened, and whoever is to blame, there's one thing that seems interesting to me. This is only happening to one candidate. Is that because of the Democratic rhetoric? Are they afraid of what he would do the second time he gets into office? He is old, and this would be his last term. Maybe he doesn't have any reservations with making foundational changes to the system, which I believe is marred by corruption and corporate interests. You can form your own opinions about this. However, I find this to be a very compelling point. And the final, most compelling point for me is a negative for Kamala Harris. I'm not sure how most people think electing a candidate is supposed to work, but the way Kamala has been appointed as the candidate is certainly not it. It is insane to me that Democrats are not rioting in the streets that Harris was appointed and not selected in the primaries by a single person. In fact, if her performance in the 2020 primaries were any indication, she more than likely would not have been the nominee. As a Democrat, I would be furious with this, because instead of being able to select a stronger candidate, this is what you're stuck with. In my opinion, even Walz, Kamala's VP selection, would have been a stronger choice at the top of the ticket than Harris herself. So how does this play out? About a year ago, I was having a conversation with a friend where I told him I thought Trump would easily win the primary and lose the general election in convincing fashion. This was based primarily on the Republican base's fervent dedication and love for him, but how disgusted and annoyed everyone else was, including centrists. I personally can look past his antics, but I also know that I'm not in the majority. I thought if Democrats were willing to vote for an old man who was having senior moments 4 years ago, what would stop them from doing it again now? Obviously, that's changed. Joe Biden was so old, you literally saw him fall apart on stage, and he was replaced by Kamala Harris. Now, if the Democrats had any sort of fair primary, I think I would still be right in my original projection. However, as you can probably tell by my review of both candidates, I honestly think they picked probably the worst candidate. And for what? To keep all the money Biden raised? Because Kamala is easily bent to the whims of the party or corporate interests? The problem is she's still tied to this administration, which has been horrible economically. It's been plagued by rampant inflation and has been run over by an influx of illegal immigrants. Quite honestly, I think if either party had literally any other candidate running, they would win in a landslide. But we are held hostage by a cult of personality on one side and the political machine on the other. I do think Donald Trump ends up winning, but barely. The media hasn't been covering him as much, and although they may think they're harming him in doing this, because in 2016 they covered him nonstop, and in no small part that probably did lead to him winning. I think this time around, though, it actually helps him. The entire reason he lost in 2020 was because people were just sick of having to hear him flying off the handle literally every day. And now, not having to be reminded of that, him being taken off Twitter, although now he's been reinstated, and just basically screaming into the abyss of Truth Social, mixed with the awful state that we find ourselves in today, and a deeply flawed candidate, means that they're all but handing Trump the victory, in my opinion. Ideally, we can get to a world with better quality candidates. I don't know how anyone can be happy that these are our two choices for who is running the country. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of people that could be selected from, and this is really the best we have. However, unfortunately, I don't think anything changes until we start demanding better of the systems, and that begins with ourselves.